Welcome to Make It Clear interview. Should the Czech Republic adopt the euro? Is there really no Russian gas flowing into Germany? Why does Alternative für Deutschland currently have the support of 17% of Germans? What would a conflict with China mean for European economies? And what are the causes of the high rate of inflation? We will talk about it too. Our outstanding guest today is a professor of economics, the long-term president of the German Ifo Institute for Economic Research, the author of important German social reforms under the government of Gerhard Schröder, and today also an advisor to the German Ministry of Economy. He is considered one of the most influential and important German and world economists. He was among the critics of Angela Merkel's government, criticized the European currency euro and the unreasonable green policy. Professor Hans-Werner Sinn. The interview was conducted by Hanna Lipovská.
Professor Sinn, thank you for accepting our invitation. Let's start with the current world economic situation. Which economies are winners and which are losers of recent situation?
That's a big question. China is having difficulties in the moment, is not growing as fast as before. The United States are recovering. In Europe, Germany is having difficulties. The industrial production is weak. France is coming. In the east, Poland, I think, is very successful. All Eastern European countries are more or less successful. So, yeah, the picture is mixed, and to some extent, it's a natural convergence process. That is, countries which not too long ago were communist and had a very miserable situation are gradually approaching the others. So the water levels even out.
You described the situation in the European Union in particular. But what's the position of the European Union within the world economies? There is Brazil, Turkey, India, you've mentioned China.
The European Union is a union of mature economies to a large extent, and the growth comes from the Eastern European countries which are catching up. So the European Union is not performing as well as, of course, the emerging countries. The emerging countries beat everyone.
And what's the reason?
This is the adjustment. This is the adjustment. When you have world trade, then countries with a lower living standard, lower level of development have absolute cost advantages, not only relative ones, and they are good, fierce competitors for that reason. They offer their products cheaply, and they can go into mass production. So what we have seen is an outsourcing development in the last 20, 30 years, where the countries of Western Europe and the United States outsourced the more labor-intensive parts of their production chain to emerging countries. Germany, I once called a bazaar economy for that reason. So the value added in Germany to a final product, which is then delivered to the world market, has been declining. And this is because many activities, labor-intensive activities, have been outsourced. This is not in itself bad. It is an advantage in principle for both Germany and the other countries. But it is as if, you have two lakes, and all of a sudden you open the gate between them, and then there is a rapid flow of water and the levels adjust.
According to the last public opinion poll, the German political party Alternative for Germany has the support of 17% of citizens for the first time. On the other hand, the Social Democratic Party of Germany and the Free Democratic Party of Germany, as well as Greens, are losing. And the Christian Democratic Union, with its sister party, the Christian Social Union, is stagnating. Why is the support for the Alternative for Germany growing, now being the third strongest party in Germany according to this poll?
Yes, of course, the Alternative für Deutschland was created when the euro showed its first difficulties, and Mrs. Merkel had said there is no alternative to the rescue program policies which we carry out. So when Greece was close to bankruptcy, she was pressed by France to open her purse and give a lot of money to Greece so that Greece was able to pay its foreign creditors, actually to a large extent French ones. French banks had huge investments in Greece. So it was a policy to help the banks in Western Europe, which had financed that country, which was against the Maastricht Treaty. And she said, this is without alternatives. I belong to those who strongly denied that this was without alternatives. And some of my colleagues, not I, were so upset that they thought they have to found a party. Bernd Lucke, in particular, an economics professor, was a founding member. And okay, he set the kernel for a new seed. He set a new seed for the flower that developed thereafter and kept growing. And then came additional difficulties with the traditional approach. In 2015, as you know, there was the refugee crisis, and Mrs. Merkel had said that Germany cannot have borders. It is impossible to keep people out if they want to move in, and that also irritated lots of people. Actually, it wasn't true, as the pandemic showed. There, all of a sudden, it was possible to have borders everywhere between the countries, even between Germany and France. There was an existing border with border controls and so on. So people were not content with this policy. And then there was the Green Revolution, which the Greens were gaining power because of the global warming problem, and they were pressing to change everything in the energy provision of Germany, and Mrs. Merkel at the time gave way. She had her policy of asymmetric demobilization, as she called it, which meant that whenever another party had a theme which would bring the people on their side, she would imitate them and do exactly the same as the others. And in this case, the Greens wanted to abandon the nuclear power plants, and Mrs. Merkel said, oh, then let's do it ourselves, so that the voters would not go away. And the result is that Germany is now reducing its nuclear power enormously, if to zero. The actual decisions are that all nuclear power plants will be shut down to zero this year, and that amidst an energy crisis when the gas prices have increased enormously because the interruption of the Russian gas deliveries to Germany. And people see that this somehow doesn't fit together, and they are discontent with that. So there are many reasons to be not content with the development. And then there are many people actually, who think that it would be dangerous to deliver weapons to the Ukraine and be drawn gradually into a very ugly and perhaps unsolvable conflict. And of course there are others, and the majority is on the other side. who think there is again no alternative.
10 years ago, you said that the European Union has been intended as a project to bring prosperity and create new jobs at the same time. In the last 10 or 15 years, we've witnessed enormous economic problems within the European Union. And currently, for example, the Czech Prime Minister, as well as the German Foreign Minister, claim that we are at war. We are at war with Putin. So do you think that the union of peace and prosperity still exists?
Yes, I think it continues to be true, this sentence. The European Union was a very useful development for Europe, overcoming the difficult history of wars and disruption in Europe. And trade is always beneficial. It is allowing for the division of labor. Each one can specialize on something. And in particular, the smaller European countries are gaining a lot from it because they don't have an internal market to develop large-scale production. But if they have the European market, then even a small country can successfully produce cars, for example, like the Czech Republic. Škoda is very successful, but it would not be successful if it just had the Czech market. No? This is for sure. And then all these large-scale production benefits would be captured by the big countries like Germany, which have an internal market. So, no, there's no doubt that the EU is a beneficial institution. The question is everything okay? What the EU does, that's a different issue. And here there are lots of things one can criticize. One aspect which is not so successful, has not been so successful, is the introduction of the euro. I think the euro was a too ambitious project, and in the end it has created lots of difficulties for those countries which were in it, largely because the euro brought low interest rates for everyone. It abolished the risk premium because the investors thought everyone who is in the euro will never go bankrupt. And that induced a number of countries to overborrow, and they had an artificial boom in the first years of the euro, which was driving up prices and wages and destroyed their competitiveness. And the end result was that then the EU had to organize fiscal transfer programs between those countries to compensate for this loss of competitiveness. Without the euro, they would have been able to devalue their currencies and maintain competitiveness that way. So in hindsight, I think it would be a possible position to say, and I would share that it would have been better not to have the euro. I say that even though at the time I was in favor of the euro because I thought it is a very useful political project for Europe. Now I see more dangers in the euro than advantages, but it doesn't mean that we can abandon the euro, because it's there. You know, you cannot disentangle a scrambled egg and make an ordinary egg out of it. We have to work within the system and to gradually improve the difficulty, the deficiencies, and overcome the difficulties.
Germany and many other countries pay in euros, but the Czech Republic is still outside the eurozone. 10 years ago, in 2013, you advised us not to join the eurozone. Today, however, we have many politicians in the Czech coalition government who support the common currency. In these days, when we celebrated 30 years of the Czech crown, there are the voices that we should abandon the crown and adopt the euro. One argument is that the euro is a stable protection of our savings. Would you agree with such a statement?
No, it's definitely not. We are currently having an inflation rate of more than 8%. Last year, it hovered even around 11%. And that clearly indicates that it's not a stable currency if you have so much inflation. Think of Switzerland, which has its own currency. They have very, very little inflation. They revalue their currency instead of being affected by this worldwide inflationary trend. You know, it's a worldwide trend. It's not limited to Europe. But in other parts of the world, in the United States in particular, the Federal Reserve Bank did similar policies. They poured lots of money into the economy during the crises of the past few years, since the Lehman crisis 2008, one crisis after the other, you know, and then the pandemic. And so the monetary base, M0, as some people, as Keynes called it, the original monetary, the original money made by the central bank, not the additional book money which the private banking sector creates. This one expanded enormously. It expanded in the United States, it expanded in Britain, it expanded in Europe, and everyone copied everyone else. The end result is that while in the pandemic we had delivery problems and lockdowns, and the supply side was hurt and was reduced enormously, the demand was sustained through the help of the central banks. They bought government bonds, and the governments were able to issue more bonds to finance their budget, and gave it to the people to sustain the incomes and the purchasing power. But the production broke away through the pandemic, and that created an excess demand, and that excess demand generated the inflation of the Western world. And the Europeans were even more active here than the Americans, because their monetary base increased about twice as fast as the American one relative to GDP. So the end result is that we are over-flooded with money, that it is very difficult to bring the interest rates up. The short-term interest rates can be manipulated, they can be increased, but the point of this previous policy to bring the long-term rates down by buying government bonds and driving their rates of return down, and to reverse this in a sufficient way, is very difficult, because then all these government bonds which are in the portfolios of the central banks would have to be returned to the market, and their prices would go down, and there would be enormous losses for the private banking system, there would be losses for the central bank system, there would be losses for the state, and the truth would come out that in the past the governments bought the central banks bought government bonds which were not so solid. So this is a one-way road, what they did, particularly since 2015 with the QE program, when huge amounts of money were used to buy government bonds. And to return is very difficult. And if it is so difficult, then it is difficult to really break the inflation trend. We have, up to this day, a rapidly increasing inflation rate for the core products. If you take energy out and food, then you see that these fluctuations of these energy prices, which may have contributed did contribute last year to this extraordinary inflation, that is not really the cause. The problem is deeper, and the inflation rate is currently in the order of 7%, and in particular it has been rising month for month, and that is dangerous.
In the Czech Republic, it's now about 18%.
That is very much, and I can only advise you to revalue your currency and not intervene in the market. So then you would separate your own inflation rate from the rest of the world in the Eurozone.
For a long time, say since the last century, economists and politicians have believed that there's a relationship between interest rates and the price level and inflation. However, then we saw negative interest rates from the ECB and the Fed. We saw qualitative easing in the European Union, in the United States and other countries and other economies, but we didn't see any high inflation. There were extremely low interest rates, extremely low inflation. Now, with a time gap of say 10 years, we have relatively high interest rates. For example, 7% in the Czech Republic, and very high inflation. Does this mean that the mechanism of a relationship between interest rate and inflation just broken down, that it doesn't exist? Or does it mean that we are forgetting the role of time lags in monetary policy?
I don't see that anything breaks down here. We have more inflation, we have higher interest rates, and the cause goes from the inflation to the interest rates. The central banks increase the interest rates, and also market participants, of course, contribute to the explanation of the interest rates. If the inflation rate is high, the creditors want a higher rate of interest to compensate for that, and the debtors are willing to pay because they know they repay with devalued money. The only thing is, which is a sort of puzzle, that the interest rates do not go up, or did not go up to the same extent as the inflation rates went up. So the real rates of interest rate minus inflation rate was declining. And the reason is that people do not, in the short run at least, really look at real interest rates, but at nominal interest rates, because that is what matters for their liquidity calculations. If you want to borrow for a house, you ask yourself, what is my annual interest burden? What do I have to repay to the bank? And can I bear that out of my income? They don't take into account that during inflation, their own incomes will rise in addition or following the prices, because the unions intervene and so on, and that it will become easier and easier to repay. It takes a while for people to learn this. And so if the interest rates would fully follow the inflation rates, that would be a strong brake on economic activity, and the central banks are very cautious not to overdo it here with their policies, which I understand. The other point is monetary policy. If you have that in mind, does not an expansion of the monetary base does not automatically in itself increase the price level. That's an old question of economics. Friedman and others had discussed that. And this relationship exists, if at all, only for a longer period of time. And that has to do with the fact that money which a central bank pours into the economy can be hoarded rather than becoming something that increases aggregate demand. And this hoarding process has been described by Keynes. That was actually the big achievement of John Maynard Keynes, who wrote in the 30s that he understood that people can save income by just hoarding money, and this money is taken out of the circuit. And as long as they are willing to hoard, if the central bank pours more money into the economy, it won't help. It helps in the very first moment if the government finances, say, its budget indirectly through money printing, but then the money goes to the hoard and doesn't go to the circuit. But, you know, at one stage, a little ignition is is enough to generate a rapid increase in the price level. And this was the pandemic. As I explained before, there was a negative supply shock through the worldwide pandemic. The delivery of goods wasn't sufficient to meet aggregate demand, and that created inflation. If the central banks and the governments had done a parallel policy by not financing an income for which there was no production, but allowing the incomes to be reduced with a reduction in the production level, then the inflation would not have taken place. But now it's there. And even if the pandemic is over, it doesn't mean that the inflation stops, because there are lots of self-reinforcing, multiplying effects. Once the fire has started to burn, it doesn't matter whether the match that ignited it initially is still burning or not. It continues by itself. And these processes are, for example, the wage price spiral. The price level goes up, or better, wage price spiral. The price level goes up. The unions see that the real wages of their members decline, and they want a compensation in terms of higher wages. And that in turn forces the firms to increase their prices again, and then again the wages go up, and so on. Another problem is hoarding of goods. You know, when there is a deflationary environment, people tend to hoard money because they think, if I hoard it, I can spend it later, perhaps even at lower prices. But if there is an inflationary environment, as we have today, then people hoard goods. They buy commodities because they know next year they are more expensive. We don't see that too much already at this time, but we see with private households, but we see it with firms. Firms in Europe are hoarding materials which they need for their production, intermediary goods, and they fill up their storage spaces up to the very highest limit. And that in itself has contributed to the shortage of materials and to inflation. These are two very important self-reinforcing mechanisms. Once the fire has begun to burn, it continues to burn as long as there is wood around which can burn. And then, of course, in the longer term, there are other supply constraints which are foreseeable. The demographic situation in Europe in particular implies that the workforce of younger people is shrinking, while the older people are becoming more, those who are no longer working but want to consume, and that it also generates an inflationary tendency. And further, the move towards green energies is not making everything cheaper, but everything more expensive, because this move is not coming from the markets, because the green energy is so cheap that people would voluntarily buy it. Rather, the policymakers decided to forbid all sorts of conventional fossil fuels in order to force people into green energy. And if you have to force them into green energy, that's the proof that green energy is more expensive. Some people say that green energy is cheaper as the sun doesn't send us a bill for shining. That is true, but the producers of the appliances which make electricity out of sunlight, they of course send the bill, and it is rather expensive. Okay, you can say photovoltaic kilowatt hour costs very little, and by a direct comparison that looks not so bad, but don't forget, this is a very volatile energy which you cannot compare on a one-to-one basis with adjustable, conventional energy, because the problem is that the demand is fluctuating and you need something that can adjust. So if people sleep, you need little energy, and in the morning when they cook their coffee and the first machines begin to run, then you need a lot of energy. So you need an energy which is adjustable, and that is not the green energy. It's not adjustable. The fluctuations there are exogenous. They come from the weather and are not a result of an attempt to adjust it to demand. So for that reason, green energy is very expensive. It needs a double structure. So if you have wind and solar energy, it fluctuates. Sometimes there is a dark lull, then there is no wind and no sun, and still you need the electricity. So you need all the conventional capacity and plants as before. In those situations, you cannot abandon a single conventional power plant if you move into green energy. You can gradually reduce its power when there is enough wind and enough sun, but the plant as such has to be there, and the employees have to stand there, be in a standby mode in order to be able to deliver the electricity whenever it's suddenly needed. And this means that the green energy is very expensive because it necessarily needs an adjustable conventional energy which can go inverse to the production of green energy. And so you need a double structure. You have double fixed costs if you move into the green world, and that makes that type of energy very, very expensive.
How is it that an ideology that damages the real economy is on the rise right now?
Yeah, people have, in my opinion, the right fear that we do have global warming. There are different opinions on that. I have written a book on global warming and policies against it in 2008, so I'm pretty convinced that it's not a fake. And so they want to do something. And the simplest thing they have in mind is to reduce their consumption of fossil fuels, and then they replace it with wind and solar energy. But it's not that simple. It cannot be done because you need the conventional energy as a buffer, going up and down inversely to the green energy. And you can't do it with stores. Stores simply are not available at a reasonable price and will not be for a long period to come. Batteries, impossible. Some people think you can do that with car batteries. You can deliver the electricity when it's needed in a dark lull, but we have also a seasonal problem. There would be enough energy in July, and you would have to transport it to December. You cannot do that with batteries. The electric cars, for example, need themselves more energy in the winter than they can store. They are not able to fill their batteries in July and drive for half a year until the winter is there with that content. They always need energy from the grid, and so they exacerbate this volatility problem. Yeah, why do the Greens not discuss that? Because they treat their the global warming problem more as an ideology, more a little bit like a religion. They don't want too much of a rational discourse about what can really be done from a technical and from an economic point of view in order to make this whole thing working. And there one can, of course, criticize it. Greta Thunberg and others who went to the streets and created emotions were very successful, but these emotions are not the same as a rational discourse and rational reaction to the difficulties which we have.
3 months ago you wrote, and I quote, "Say what you will about Russian President Vladimir Putin, but his war on Ukraine did open European eyes to some long underrated truths. One is that even after more than 70 years of relative peace on the continent, neglecting military securities poses grave dangers. Another is that the green dream of modern economies, powered exclusively by renewable energies, remains out of reach, and reliable access to cheap energy supplies remains essential. And you mentioned that if gas supplies from Russia are cut off, Germany simply won't be able to produce its 300 most gas-intensive products. So, to sum it up, we have the Green Deal and green politics on the one hand, and also the war in Ukraine and the lack of Russian gas on the other hand. So what's the future of industry in our part of Europe without Russian gas?
Yeah, that's very difficult because half of the gas which Germany used came from Russia, and it doesn't come anymore, at least through direct channels. The truth is, it still comes through Turkey and other pipelines, and it is washed a couple of times so that no one knows that we ultimately are consuming Russian gas in Western Europe. So the difficulties now in this winter look a little less big than one might have imagined a year ago, or when the war had broken out and the gas supplies were cut. They were cut actually not when the war broke out, but only in May, since May 2022. So we have done quite well. The stores of gas have been filled, and the winter has been surprisingly mild, so that the shortage problem this winter has not really shown up with gas. But in the long run, the question is, of course, what will the chemical industry do if the cheap gas is no longer available? Much has been replaced with LNG imports from America in the last few months, but that is very, very expensive gas, and you see it already in the figures about the chemical industry. The chemical industry is declining for that. They need a lot of gas, not only for heating processes, but also as a basic material for chemical production. So gas is a carbon dioxide, is a hydrocarbon fuel, and it's an element it's a molecule which goes into ammoniac production and other types of chemical production, which is the basis of whole branches of our chemical industry. It's not yet clear how that problem will be overcome. German chemical companies react by investing in China, by investing in the United States, where the energy is cheaper, but it's not so good for the workforce in Germany. People would like to keep their jobs, of course, which is not clear.
You mentioned that there is a potential issue of Taiwan and a conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan. Do you think this is another issue that may negatively affect German and European industry this year or next year?
Yeah, of course. A large fraction of the semiconductors come from Taiwan. It's a very important country in the international supply chain. But on top of that, if there is a tension about Taiwan, and there's a conflict between the United States and China, mainland China, that will be a big problem for Germany, because it is so dependent on imports from China. China is now Germany's most important trading partner, more important than the United States of America. And in particular, German industry needs intermediate products from China. if you look to the statistics, you see 600 major categories in the German statistics, where more than 50% of our imports from other countries come actually from China. Germany is closely intertwined with China, needs China, China needs Germany, China copies Germany. China is looking more to Germany than any other country in Europe. Actually, this is a very, very big problem. I think it is not wise to let this conflict above China over Taiwan emerge. Somehow one has to settle here to rational discourse and calm the moods, because also the Greens should take that into account. If what happens with their policies, if they want to reduce the CO2 output in this world, how can they ever succeed if there is a conflict with China? No way, because if we stop consuming tradable fossil fuel like oil, like hard coal, like gas, what happens? Would these fossil fuels remain in the ground? No, of course not. They will still be extracted by the producer countries and will just be shipped and channeled to other parts. China gets the gas from Putin now. They already last year agreed to build a new pipeline from the Yamal gas fields in Russia, in Siberia, down to Beijing directly. And the oil tankers, of course, also change their direction easily. Instead of going to Europe, when Europe no longer wants to have combustion cars, they bring the oil to China. You know, we could argue with China and say, well, hey, let's commonly take care of the world environment. Global warming has to be stopped. So please reduce your CO2 output. But if there is a conflict between China and the West, they will not listen at all to us. And they will be very happy to consume exactly those fossil fuels which we set free, which we no longer consume. And in particular, they would be happy to do so as we reduce the world market price for fossil fuels. If the Europeans no longer buy fossil fuels, then it's a strong effect on the world market price for oil, for gas, for hard coal. And China will be happy to buy all the quantities and buy even more if they could. Than before. The only way to come to a common worldwide agreement concerning the climate problem is to avoid military conflicts and tensions between the countries. And if you keep that in your mind, you should wonder what, for example, the German Greens do. The German State Secretary goes to the world and accuses other countries of violating human rights, in particular China. The Uyghurian question and other problems she brings to the surface and emphasizes once again. This may be right from a moral perspective, but you know, it's not a peaceful development with China, for which she paves the way. This is the path to conflict. And if there's conflict, she can throw all her green plans about reducing the global warming into the dustbin of history. That's the truth. And I think the Greens have not yet understood the relationship between the tensions which they create with their moral-based foreign policy and their climate goals. They have to decide what they want. They cannot have it both.
The president-elect of the Czech Republic called the Taiwanese president shortly after winning the elections. He also said that China is not a friendly country at the moment. The Czech government is reassessing relations with China and there are hostile attitudes towards China. The Speaker of the Czech Chamber of Deputies is on her way to Taiwan. Do you think that this kind of behavior threatens the economy and industry, or does it not matter?
I'm not saying that China is always a friendly country behaving well. That's a completely different issue. I'm not willing at all to make the moral argument here. I only say China is big. China will soon be the biggest economy in the world. And it is impossible for Europe or someone else, even the United States, to carry out a successful policy of keeping China down. That is problematic. It will create tensions, and that is dangerous also in terms of peace problems for the world as such, but it is in particular dangerous, and that is what I wanted to point out for the green goals, which we all have, namely to come to an agreement to use less fossil fuel everywhere in the world so as to reduce the speed of global warming. We have to do what Willy Brandt once called realpolitik, real policy. Abstract from your moral preferences, leave them away for a while. You cannot educate the world, and take other countries as they are and try to find a peaceful way of doing trade with them so everyone benefits from it, and then hope that the better model in the end finds imitators. This has worked with the fall of the Soviet Union, for example. In Europe, there was, when Willy Brandt some 50 years ago carried out his policies, some people said he was an idiot and he would only support the Soviet bloc. The opposite was true, because he negotiated free exchange of information. In Germany, the Eastern Germans could all of a sudden see Western TV, so how the life was here. People could cross the border and exchange ideas, and and then automatically the people in the East thought, well, do I really want to live in communism with this extremely low living standard forever, or shouldn't we not open the gates? And that was the beginning of a process which in the end led to the destruction of the Soviet bloc. Of course, I don't want to forget Poland with Solidarność and these developments, but that had also to do with this realpolitik and the attempt to reduce the tensions and let the people in the end decide and create internal pressure for the respective governments to change. That is a better policy than a policy of insisting on military threat and counter threat, and that only leads to a dangerous escalation. I warn everyone and advise everyone to look back to the 19th century when Britain was the world power and Germany was on the rise. Germany was growing much faster, and in the end, when Germany even developed its navy, the Britons became very nervous, and out of this period of increasing tensions, ultimately the First World War resulted. We don't want to repeat that with China and the United States of America.
This brings us to the very conclusion of this interview. You are a university professor. What do you think is the current task of economic universities, the task for future economists, for students of economics, for professors of economics?
Yeah, well, don't dream, don't look away, don't follow your basic research only, but look to the environment in which you live, to look to the real world and the actual problems as of today, and try to find solutions, participate in the public discourse, and do economic research which supports this rational debate. Don't try to be acting like pure mathematicians who find eternal truth, which is independent of this world in which we live. But confront the real issues of this world. And that is very useful for your own development, and it is useful for the world.